You cannot keep pretending that everything is fine. We all know the truth about what he did.
The last thing my husband said to me the morning before he went into the hospital for the final time was, "Margaret, no matter what happens, the house is yours. I built it for you." 3 weeks after we buried Harold, his son stood in the middle of our living room. The living room Harold and I painted ourselves the summer of 1989 and read from a piece of paper that said I had no right to remain in this house, that I would receive a modest allowance, that the estate, the investments, the property in Shenandoah, everything Harold had built over 51 years of marriage, would pass to a trust managed by a man I had never trusted. Thomas looked at me when he finished reading and said, and I want you to remember this exact sentence. He said, "You were never really blood, Margaret. This is a family decision." I was 68 years old. I had been married to Harold Olland for 51 years. I had raised 2 of his children, buried one of them, and spent 3 decades quietly building the expertise that would, in the end, dismantle everything Thomas thought he had secured. If you are watching from the beginning, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world people go when they need to hear that patience is not the same thing as weakness. My name is Margaret Olland. I was born Margaret Louise Keller in a small town outside Charlottesville, Virginia. I met Harold Olland when I was 17 and he was 22. He was working at his father's hardware supply company and I was shelving books at the county library. He used to come in every Thursday and pretend to look for books on plumbing. He did not know anything about plumbing. He just wanted to talk to me. We married when I was 19. Harold already had a son from a brief previous relationship. Thomas was 18 months old when I came into his life. I was barely an adult myself, and I raised that boy as if he were my own. I stayed up with him when he had fevers. I drove him to every baseball practice for 6 years. I sat in the back row at his college graduation and cried the way a mother cries. We had 2 more children together. Our daughter Judith came 3 years into the marriage, and our son Peter, who we lost to a car accident when he was 31. That grief is the kind that does not leave. It just changes shape over the years. Harold was a good man, a private man. He did not talk about money the way some men do. He did not brag. But over 50 years, he had built something real. The hardware company became a regional distributor. He sold it in 2014 for more than anyone expected. The house in Charlottesville, the 23 acres in Shenandoah, investment spread across several accounts. Harold was not careless with any of it. He had a plan. What Harold did not plan for was the last 14 months of his life. He was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia in the spring of the year before he died. The doctors were careful and measured in the way doctors are trained to be. They said early stage, and I heard that word early and thought we had more time than we did. Harold had good days and difficult days. On the good days, he was completely himself. On the difficult days, he forgot where he put things, lost the thread of conversations, grew frustrated in ways that were not like him. Thomas began calling more frequently after the diagnosis. I thought it was love. I thought he was worried about his father. He would drive up from Richmond on weekends and sit with Harold on the porch. He brought Candace, his wife, who had always been polite in the way that means nothing. And he brought Raymond, Candace's brother, who had a financial consulting business and a handshake that lasted a half second longer than it should. I should tell you something about myself that I did not tell people easily. For 30 years, before I retired in 2018, I worked as an estate fraud examiner contracted to Harper & Olland Associates, a law firm in Richmond. My maiden name and the firm's name are coincidental. I came to that work through a circuitous path. I had started as an administrative assistant, developed a meticulous eye for document irregularities, and over time became someone the firm trusted with the most sensitive cases. I was not a licensed attorney, but I had reviewed thousands of wills, trusts, and probate filings. I knew what a legitimate document looked like. I knew what a manufactured one looked like. I never talked about this at family gatherings. Harold knew. He was proud of it in his quiet way. But to Thomas and Judith and Raymond Pratt, I was just a retired school teacher who liked to garden and read mysteries. Let them think that. In November, 2 months before Harold died, something shifted. Thomas began arriving with paperwork. He said he was helping Harold organize his affairs. Harold, on those particular days, seemed tired and agreeable in a way that made my chest tighten. I sat in on 2 of those conversations. Thomas would explain things quickly, use language that sounded official, and Harold would nod. I asked questions. Thomas said I was being difficult. He said these were financial matters and that I had never been involved in the finances. That was false. I had been involved in every financial decision Harold and I made together for 5 decades. But I chose not to argue in front of Harold. I did not want Harold's last months to be filled with conflict. What I did instead was pay attention. In December, I found Harold at the kitchen table alone, looking at a document. He held it out to me and said, "Margaret, did I sign something?" He looked genuinely uncertain. The document was a signature page for what appeared to be an amendment to his estate planning. I photographed it before Thomas arrived that afternoon and collected it from the table. Harold died in January. He passed at home, which was what he wanted. Thomas and Judith were present. I was holding his hand. For a few days after, I let myself only be his wife. I did not think about documents or signatures. I just missed him. But grief has its own timetable, and the world does not pause for it. 3 weeks after the funeral, Thomas called a family meeting. He used that phrase, a family meeting. He said it would be held at the house, which he referred to as the estate property. He copied Raymond Pratt on the email. He did not copy me. Judith forwarded it to me with a short note that said, "You should be there." There were 7 people in the living room that afternoon. Thomas, Candace, Raymond Pratt, Judith and her husband Neil, Thomas's adult daughter from his first marriage, whose name is Becca, and me. A man I did not recognize sat near the window with a leather portfolio. Thomas introduced him as a notary, there to witness the reading and formal acknowledgement of the will. The reading took 11 minutes. According to the document Thomas held, Harold Alland had revised his will in October of the previous year. The revised will established a family trust. Thomas and Judith were named as co-trustees. Raymond Pratt was named as financial administrator of the trust with sole discretionary authority over investment decisions. I was named as a beneficiary to the extent of a monthly residential allowance of $3,000, with the provision that I vacate the primary residence within 18 months to allow the property to be evaluated for potential sale. $3,000 a month. 18 months to leave the house Harold built for me. The Shenandoah property was designated for immediate transfer to the trust. The investment accounts, totaling what Harold and I had built together over half a century, would fall under Raymond Pratt's management. Becca, Thomas's daughter whom Harold had loved but seen infrequently, was listed for a one-time payment of $40,000. When Thomas finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Candace said, softly, "This is what Harold wanted. He spent a lot of time on this decision." She said it with the gentleness of someone who has rehearsed it. I looked at Thomas. He looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as resolved. He had decided something, and in his mind it was finished. Then he said the sentence I already told you. The one about blood. The one about family decisions. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. There was grief, yes. There was the specific grief of being erased by someone you raised. But underneath that, there was something else. Something very quiet and very old. It was the part of me that had spent 30 years reading documents that liars thought were perfect. I looked at the will Thomas had just read from. I looked at the date in the upper right corner. I looked at the witness signatures on the last page. And I felt the specific, cold clarity that had made me good at my job for 3 decades. Something was wrong with that document. I did not say anything. I accepted the copy Thomas's notary provided. I thanked everyone for coming. I made coffee. I moved through the rest of that afternoon, the way you move through a place when you already know you will need to remember every detail of it. After everyone left, I sat at Harold's desk and I called an old colleague. His name is Walter Briggs. He is a document examiner who had consulted for Harper and Alland Associates for 15 years. I told him what I needed. He said he could have a preliminary assessment within 10 days. Thomas called the following morning and asked if I had any questions about the transition timeline. He was careful. He was friendly. He said he hoped this would be straightforward. I said it would be. I meant something completely different by that. The next few weeks were the kind that looked quiet from the outside. I went to the grocery store. I had coffee with my neighbor Donna. I drove to the library twice. I planted bulbs in the back garden because Harold had always wanted tulips in the spring, and I intended to be there to see them come up. But while all of that was happening, other things were happening too. Judith came by one afternoon without Thomas. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands and said, "Margaret, I need you to know I didn't have a choice." I pressed her on that. She said Thomas had told her the new will was what their father wanted. She said Raymond had shown her documentation. She said she had signed because Thomas said it was already done. I asked her when she had last spoken to Harold alone, without Thomas present. She thought about it. She said she wasn't sure. Maybe 8 months before he died. Maybe longer. I nodded. I told her I understood. And I did understand. But I also filed that information away in the part of my mind where I kept the things that would matter later. Walter Briggs called me on a Tuesday morning with his preliminary findings. He was careful with his words, the way professionals are when they are telling you something significant. He said the document I had photographed in December and the certified copy of the will Thomas had provided showed several inconsistencies he would want to examine further. He noted that the paper stock appeared different between sections. He noted that 2 of the witness signatures showed lateral pressure patterns inconsistent with the notarization date. And most significantly, he noted that the signature attributed to Harold on the revised will showed tremor characteristics that did not match samples from documents Harold had signed in the prior year. Harold's handwriting had changed with his illness, but it had changed in a specific direction. His letters had become smaller and closer together, a contraction pattern common to his type of dementia. The signature on the revised will did not contract. It shook in a wide, lateral arc that looked like someone imitating a tremor they had observed, but not fully understood. Walter said, "This is not Harold's signature, Margaret." He said it plainly, because we had known each other for a long time, and he knew I needed plain. I sat with that for a day. Then I opened the filing cabinet in Harold's home office, the one with the combination only Harold and I knew, and I removed the envelope that had been there since 2019. Harold and I had made his will together in 2019 with an attorney named Constance Farwell at a firm in Charlottesville. The will was straightforward. The house to me. The Shenandoah property to me. The investment account split, with provision for Thomas and Judith and a trust for Becca, and a memorial gift to the Children's Hospital, where Peter had been treated. I was the primary beneficiary. I was named executor. That document had been sitting in our filing cabinet for 4 years, untouched. Harold had never revised it. Harold had never, to my knowledge, been presented with a reason to revise it. And based on what Walter Briggs was telling me, Harold had likely never signed the document Thomas read aloud in our living room. I made copies of everything. I called Constance Farwell. She pulled the original from her firm's secure archive. It matched mine exactly. I then spent 2 weeks doing what I had been trained to do. Methodically, without anger in the room, because anger makes you sloppy. I requested Harold's medical records for the 14 months prior to his death. His primary physician had noted at multiple appointments that Harold's decision-making capacity was considered impaired, and that any legal documents executed during periods of assessed incapacity should be scrutinized carefully. That notation was in the record. It had been there the whole time. I contacted Raymond Pratt's business registration through the Virginia State Corporation Commission. His consulting firm, Pratt Capital Management, had been registered in 2021. Before that, Raymond had worked at a financial services firm from which he had quietly departed following an internal compliance investigation in 2020. The details of that investigation were not public, but the departure itself was documentable. I spoke with Thomas's daughter, Becca. I want to be clear about something. Becca was not involved in what her father did. She was a 26-year-old woman who had received a check and been told it was her grandfather's gift to her. When I told her there might be irregularities in the estate documents, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My dad has been stressed about money for years." I didn't know that meant anything like this. I told her it wasn't her burden to carry, and I meant it. I retained an attorney. not from Harper and Alland Associates, because I wanted no appearance of prior relationship complicating the matter. I hired a woman named Patricia Drummond, who practiced estate litigation in Charlottesville and had a reputation for precision. I gave her everything: the original will, Walter Briggs's examination report, the medical records, the incorporation history of Pratt Capital Management, the photographs I had taken in December. Patricia reviewed all of it over a weekend and called me Monday morning. She said, "Margaret, you have a very strong case." She also said, "This is going to be difficult personally." I told her I had been in difficult rooms before. She said she believed me. The process took 3 months from the date I retained Patricia to the date we were ready to move. During those 3 months, Thomas called twice to check on the transition timeline. He was patient. He was pleasant. I told him I was still adjusting to Harold's absence and asked for a little more time. He said, "Of course, take what you need." He said it warmly. I want you to understand something about what those 3 months felt like. I was living in the house Harold built. I was sleeping in the room where we had spent 51 years together. I was looking at the photographs on the walls and the garden he had tended and the desk where he had sat every morning with his coffee. And I was also building, piece by piece, a case that would establish that his son had forged his final wishes. I did not feel triumphant during those months. I felt a particular kind of sad. The kind that arrives when you understand that the worst thing has already happened and what remains is just consequence. Patricia filed a petition to contest the will in the Circuit Court of Charlottesville in early April. She simultaneously filed a motion for an emergency accounting freeze on the trust assets, which was granted within 48 hours on the grounds of documented fraud suspicion. Raymond Pratt's access to the investment accounts was suspended pending hearing. Thomas did not know this was coming. The morning the freeze was granted, I drove to Thomas and Candace's house in Richmond. I had called ahead and asked to come. Thomas assumed I was coming to discuss the transition. He met me at the door in a sweater, relaxed. Candace was in the kitchen. I could hear coffee being made. I sat down in their living room. I placed a folder on the coffee table. I told Thomas the first had retained an attorney. I told him a will contest had been filed that morning. I told him an independent document examiner had found the signature on the revised will to be inconsistent with Harold's established signing patterns. I told him the original will, executed with Constance Farwell in 2019, had been preserved and matched in both the firm's archive and my personal records. I did not raise my voice. I have never found it necessary. Thomas's face changed in stages. First there was confusion, the brief flash of someone who thinks they might have misheard. Then there was something else. He looked at the folder on the table, and he looked at me and he said, "Margaret, you don't understand what you're doing." I told him I understood exactly what I was doing. Candace came into the room then. She was holding a coffee cup. She looked at her husband, then at me, then at the folder. Thomas said something to her in a low voice that I did not catch. She set the coffee cup down very carefully. I told Thomas that Patricia would be in contact with his attorney. I told him that Walter Briggs would be submitting a certified examination report to the court. I told him that Harold's medical records, which documented impaired decision-making capacity during the period when the fraudulent will was supposedly executed, had already been entered into the case file. I told him that Raymond Pratt's regulatory history, including the 2020 compliance investigation at his former employer, had been subpoenaed by Patricia's office. Then I stood up. I picked up my folder. I told Thomas that his father had loved him, and that I had loved him for 43 years as a mother loves a child, and that what he had done was a profound betrayal of both of those truths. He did not say anything. He looked at the floor. Candace said, "This is not what it looks like." Her voice was very small. I told her it looked exactly like what it was. The court process was not a single dramatic moment. Real accountability rarely is. It moves through filings and hearings and depositions and responses to requests for production. But I want to tell you about 2 specific moments that mattered. The first was Walter Briggs's deposition. Walter had 41 years of document examination experience. He described his methodology in terms that were accessible and specific. He walked the attorneys through the lateral tremor pattern, the paper stock inconsistency, the witness signature pressure analysis. He had prepared comparative charts. He was, as he had always been, meticulous. Thomas's attorney attempted to challenge his methodology on 3 separate grounds. Walter answered each challenge calmly and completely. At the end of the deposition, Thomas's attorney stopped asking questions. The second moment was Judith's deposition. I want to be careful about Judith because her situation was complicated. She had not forged anything. She had not planned anything. But she had signed documents she was told were legitimate without asking enough questions. And in doing so, she had lent the appearance of family consensus to something that was a crime. In her deposition, Judith was asked when she had last observed Harold executing legal documents without Thomas present. She said she could not recall any such occasion in the last year of Harold's life. She was asked whether she had had independent legal counsel review the documents before she signed as a co-trustee. She said Thomas had told her it wasn't necessary. She was asked whether Raymond Pratt had any prior professional relationship with Thomas before being named financial administrator of the trust. She paused for a long time before answering. She said yes. She said Thomas and Raymond had been doing informal business together for at least 3 years. Judith did not look at me during most of her deposition, but near the end she did. It was a brief look. I did not read triumph into it. I read relief. The complicated relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. Raymond Pratt's attorney negotiated separately. Raymond's exposure was the most direct. He had agreed to serve as administrator of a trust he had material reason to suspect was fraudulently constituted, and his prior compliance history made his position difficult to defend as innocent. His attorney began discussions with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in late May. Candace Allen retained her own attorney in early June. That was when I understood that the architecture Thomas had built was beginning to come apart at the seams, because when people get separate attorneys, they have stopped trusting each other. The hearing on the will contest was scheduled for August. But in July, Thomas's attorney contacted Patricia. Thomas was prepared to acknowledge the 2019 will as the governing document. He was prepared to cooperate with the investigation into the fraudulent will's origin. He was not prepared to admit, in those words, to having created it. But he was prepared to not contest it any further. Patricia told me about the offer on the phone. She said it was not a full confession and asked how I felt about it. I said, "What does it do for the estate?" She said, "It restores it completely. The house, the Shenandoah property, the accounts. Everything reverts to the 2019 provisions." I said, "Then take it and let the criminal process run separately." She did. The Commonwealth's Attorney's Office charged Raymond Pratt with elder financial abuse and conspiracy to commit will fraud. He accepted a plea agreement in October that included a suspended sentence, significant fines, and the permanent revocation of his ability to serve as a financial fiduciary in the Commonwealth of Virginia. His consulting firm was dissolved. Thomas was charged with will fraud and undue influence in the execution of a legal instrument. His case went through a longer process. He ultimately pleaded no contest to a reduced charge in exchange for full cooperation, restitution of all legal fees to the estate, and a formal civil judgment that precluded him from contesting Harold's estate further in any future proceeding. He did not serve prison time. His attorney argued, and the court accepted, that Harold's emotional decline had distorted Thomas's sense of entitlement in ways that did not mitigate but might contextualize his actions. I am not going to tell you how I feel about that outcome. I have learned not to mistake the absence of a prison sentence for the absence of consequences. Thomas has to live with what he did to Harold's memory. He has to live with the look on Becca's face when she learned what her father had done. He has to live with the knowledge that his sister testified honestly at a deposition and did not protect him. Those are consequences. Candace's involvement was ultimately characterized as knowing but passive. She had not executed any documents. She was not charged. She and Thomas separated 18 months after the case concluded. I do not know whether that was a consequence or simply a marriage that had been under strain for other reasons. Judith and I spoke at length after everything concluded. It was not an easy conversation. There are things between us that will require more time than one conversation can hold. But she came to the house in December, 2 years after Harold died, and she walked through the room she had grown up in. She cried. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table the way we had sat at that table for 40 years. She said she was sorry. I told her that sorry was a beginning and not an end, and that I intended to stay in relationship with her because Harold would have wanted that. That is not forgiveness handed over like a gift. That is work in progress. The tulips Harold always wanted came up that first spring, pink and yellow, in the bed along the south fence. I was there to see them. Becca still calls me on Harold's birthday. She tells me about her life. Last year she got a promotion and called to tell me before she told her father. I thought about what that meant for a moment, and then I decided not to overthink it. I just told her I was proud of her. Harold would have been proud of her too. There is something I want to say, and I want to say it without wrapping it in instructions, because this is not that kind of story. I was 68 years old when Thomas stood in my living room and told me I was not really family. I had spent 30 years building an expertise I never mentioned at holiday dinners because it did not seem relevant. I had spent 51 years in a marriage that was the center of my life. I had buried a son and raised 2 children I did not give birth to, and planted flowers in a garden and painted walls and sat at bedsides and done every single thing a person does when they have decided to love a family fully. And the knowledge that saved me, the thing I had spent decades quietly accumulating, was never something I held in front of myself as a shield. It was just something I knew. It was mine, in the way that things you work for honestly become yours. I think about Harold in that kitchen, holding that document, asking me, Margaret, did I sign something? He knew even then. Not the details, but something in him knew. I signed for him in the end, not with a pen. With everything I had learned in 30 years of looking at documents and knowing the difference between what is true and what someone wishes were true. The house is still mine. The Shenandoah property is still mine. The tulips came up again this spring. I think Harold would have found this whole thing almost funny, in that dry, quiet way he had. He would have sipped his coffee and looked at me over the rim of the cup and said, I always told you you were the smartest person in any room you walked into, Margaret. He was right about most things. He was right about that.